Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event on Who Owns the Twin Cities. My name is Kimberly Burrows, and I'm a Technical Assistant Manager at the Urban Institute. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you today. We have quite a bit to dig into, so before we start, I want to go over some quick housekeeping. Today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online after the webinar. Speaker bios are available online at urban.org, and a link to the bios will be posted in the chat. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust our settings, click on the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. During the session, all participants are muted, but you can send your questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. And we hope we'll have enough time for audience Q&A after our panel discussion today. And finally, if you tweet about the event, please tweet using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. The research that my colleagues are presenting today is a culmination of 2.5 years of collaboration with housing and community development partners based in the Twin Cities. Many you'll meet in our panel discussion segment a little later today. In the Twin Cities region, as well as other places across the US, housing affordability and stability challenges have become more salient during the pandemic, particularly as these gaps widen along racial lines. It was this recognition of the problem and acute need for regional solutions based in inclusive recovery that encouraged this research. I'd like to publicly congratulate the research team, Yona Freemark, Eleanor Noble, and Ipong Su for their research. In addition, I want to acknowledge our other Urban Institute colleagues, some present and former, that have been instrumental to the framing of this work. These include Solomon Green, Maya Brennan, Gabriela Velasco, Aria Cohen, and Lydia Lowe. Now that I've given you a little teaser into our presentation, I'd like to hand over to my colleagues, Dr. Yona Freemark and Eleanor Noble.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today, and thank you very much, Kimberly, for the introduction. Let's have the next slide, please. So we're excited to be able to share some of our research findings with the broader community before we move into the panel session that we'll have later today. We don't have time to describe our research methods, but they are detailed in the report that you'll find linked in the chat box later. And we can provide more information during the Q&A session if that's helpful. So let's begin with some of our findings. As many of you know, the Twin Cities region already suffers from the highest Black-white homeownership gap in the country. The question for us to consider, though, is how that gap has changed over time and where it appears to be concentrated. Next slide, please. Go on, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So our first data point is that for the 2 counties we're studying, white-headed households have had consistently high homeownership rates, about 70% from 2000 all the way into 2018. Latino-headed households, shown on the right of this slide, had much lower rates, about 35%, and Black households, shown in the center of this slide, have had the lowest. Asian and American Indian families also had lower rates of homeownership, but we do not explore data pertaining to them in this study because of limitations on available information. Concerningly, the homeownership rate of Black households has dropped off dramatically since 2000 in the Twin Cities region. It slid from 31% to 21% in less than 2 decades. Over that time, even though the total number of Black-headed households increased by 31,000 in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, the number of Black owners only grew by 2,000, meaning 93% of new Black families became renters in the region. That's a huge loss in community wealth and the potential for family wealth creation. Next slide. This page shows how the gap between people of color and white families has grown over time. The 2 charts on the left show that the Latino white and Black white gap in homeownership have both grown dramatically from 2000 to 2008. One thing that surprised us, though, was that this gap has grown most dramatically in the whitest neighborhoods, as you see on the far right. In neighborhoods that are more than 90% white, the gap between Black and white homeownership has increased from 25 percentage points to 63 percentage points over the past 2 decades. Next slide. We wanted to determine whether the gaps in homeownership that are differentiating Black and white families have something to do with neighborhood change. Are dynamics like gentrification causing Black families to stop owning in certain places? To perform this analysis, we used a neighborhood typology developed by the University of Minnesota. As you see here on this map of Hennepin and Ramsey counties, neighborhoods experiencing high levels of displacement, shown in blue, places where low-income families are leaving and high-income families are arriving, are concentrated in central Minneapolis, in the areas around downtown. So are neighborhoods experiencing growth in general, shown in green, where both low and high-income families are arriving. Next slide. So what is occurring in those neighborhoods that are experiencing displacement in terms of homeownership? We found that those communities were the places where the Black-white homeownership gap increased the most from 2000 to 2018 compared to other neighborhoods throughout the region. It increased by more than 10 percentage points overall in those places. At the same time, median rent increased by 18% in those communities, adjusted for inflation. In other words, those neighborhoods which are experiencing displacement and gentrification are experiencing change that it negatively impacts both low-income families and homeowners of color, both renters and homeowners. I'm now going to pass it on to my colleague, Eleanor.
Thanks, Yona. So the findings that Yona just raised raises concerns about how these neighborhood transformations and shifting racialized ownership patterns really occur. So is it just wealthier, whiter families coming in and buying up these homes, or are there other dynamics at play? So to investigate this, our team decided to use parcel level property assessment data from Hennepin and Ramsey counties to estimate the level of corporate investment in single family rental homes. So this is the type of home where most people live in the Twin Cities. We've heard stories about their growing presence in other communities, but we didn't know enough of the details about what was specifically happening in the Twin Cities. So if you want to go to the next slide, and then the next one. We found two key trends. So the first one was that the number of single family homes that are being used as rental properties rather than being owned more than doubled between 2005 and 2020. So there are now about 50,000 such single family rental homes that are being rented in the two counties, and that's up from 20,000 just 15 years ago. So the rise of these units primarily occurred between 2010 and 2015, and it was a much larger percentage increase than the stock of just single family homes in general. And then at the right side of this slide, you can see that at the same time, investor ownership of these properties had more than tripled, and it went from about 4% in 2005 to nearly 14% by 2020. So we counted investors as organizations that had at least 3 single-family homes in their portfolios and had an association with an LLC, an LP, or a corporation that we found in the assessment data. And we saw that many of these same trends were present in other parts of the country in terms of these major owners. Like one company called Invitation Homes, which is associated with Blackstone, and this controls more than 500 single-family homes in the 2 core counties of the Twin Cities alone. Next slide, please. We also found that these investors took advantage of the Great Recession to buy up a lot of cheap single-family homes. So the orange line on this graph shows that before the recession, large-scale investors only bought less than about half of 1% of these units. But between 2011 and 2014, they purchased more than 2% of all single-family homes on the market. And it went as high as 4% by 2013. So these investors were taking advantage of cheap housing that was often produced by foreclosures. And you can see that in the gap between the orange line, which is the number of sales, and the gray line, which is the value of those sales. And you can see that these investors bought cheaply in 2010. Since the property they invested in was worth, on average, significantly less than the market as a whole. And you can also see that they have continued to buy at lower than overall market prices in 2020. So that tells us a bit about the current pandemic housing market. This map, if you want to go to the next slide, this map shows the spatial distribution of all single-family rentals as a share of the overall housing units in the two counties. So you can see that the single-family rentals are the least concentrated in downtown Minneapolis. Unsurprisingly, this is where multifamily housing is more common. But you can also see that throughout much of the rest of the region, both within the core cities and in the suburbs, you're seeing single-family rentals. So they're spread throughout the region. And they now make up more than 10% of overall housing stock in many communities. And you can see that in dark green on this map. If you could go to the next slide, please. So unlike the image we just saw, this distribution of single-family rentals overall, the investor-owned single-family homes have been incredibly concentrated. As you see here, investor ownership now accounts for more than 10% of all housing parcels in North Minneapolis, which for those of you who don't know is a historically Black and comparatively lower income area in Minneapolis. There are also concentrations of such investor-owned units around downtown St. Paul and in a few of the first-ring suburban areas. So this suggests yet again that the investor-owner phenomenon is being concentrated in the most vulnerable communities, and this is not the same as the rise of single-family rentals overall in the region. And this also raises questions for all of us about the appropriate and targeted policies to ensure that these communities and their residents and tenants are treated respectfully and acceptably in the coming years. Next slide, please. So we found two major trends with this part of the research. The first was that the total value of single-family rentals that were owned by investors has increased from about 300 million in 2005 to 1.3 billion in 2020. And this is just in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, and it is also adjusted for inflation. So that is a $1 billion transfer of wealth. At the same time, also adjusted for inflation, the mean value of single-family homes that are owned by actual residents declined by 8% between 2005 and 2020. So this is a concerning trend for everyone in the Twin Cities. And with that, I'm gonna pass it back off to Yona to start the panel.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. So next slide. So I would like to say, before we get into the panel discussion, that we would like to thank our funders at the McKnight Foundation, which generously provided the Urban Institute the resources that enabled us to spend our staff time researching this very important question with the Twin Cities. And as part of this, we were able to collaborate with a number of people working in nonprofit and university settings in the Twin Cities. And some of those people we were fortunate to be able to ask to join our panel today. So next slide. So you see me on the left, but then we have 4 other panel members that will be joining our conversation. So Colleen Gross-Ebinger is Vice President at the Family Housing Fund. Andrea Fursten is Vice President of Systems Innovation at the Center for Economic Inclusion. Tram Huang is Policy Advocate at the Alliance. And Anthony Damiano is Housing Policy Researcher and Urban Planning PhD at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. So we'd like to welcome them all. Thank you so much for coming here. And if possible, could we move on to the gallery view? Great. Okay, wonderful. So thank you again for being able to join our conversation. And as we said before, we're going to begin with a few preset questions that we had for you all. The audience can feel free to add questions to the Q&A, which we will get to at the end of the panel conversation if we have the time. So let's begin with a question for everybody on the panel. Our research shows that homeownership patterns are rapidly changing throughout the Twin Cities, including through reduction in Black home ownership levels and increasing rates of investor-owned single-family homes, which also indicates that neighborhoods may be in the process of changing. What are your specific concerns in vulnerable communities like North Minneapolis about changing ownership patterns? How has this informed your work? So maybe I'll just pass this off to Colleen to begin, if you're willing.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And thank you to Urban for the opportunity to speak today, and to all my colleagues. It is an honor to be on this panel with you. And I appreciate all the work that you all are doing. So, there's certainly lots to be concerned about in this presentation. And we know that the Twin Cities has among the very highest disparities in wealth and homeownership and education, and sort of keep going down the list. So this increase in corporate ownership has been certainly a challenge that many of us have been talking about and long concerned about. One of the things that I'm actually concerned about as I think about this, these large corporate portfolios, is what the owners' exit strategies will be. We are in perhaps the best sellers market that we have ever been in this community. The median home price for a home in the Twin Cities in 2019, so just 2 years ago, was $280,000. And the numbers that just came out yesterday, the new median home price is $337,000. That's a 20% increase in just 2 years. And as many people who are from here probably are hearing, and I know it's similar around the country, there's such high demand for starter homes, and new home buyers can be putting in multiple offers and often foregoing inspections and other contingencies. So in many ways, it is sort of a perfect exit strategy if you are a large investor with a large portfolio that bought cheap. And what I worry about, on the one hand, turning those back to homeownership is a really good thing, but realistically, the demographic of who is likely to buy those at this point is not going to be either A, who owned them previously, or B, who is living there now. And we have not only a dearth of affordable housing in our community, but also a real dearth of larger units that can fit families, units that have 3 to 4 bedrooms, which is often single family homes. So that is one of the significant concerns I have, is what happens to the households who are living there if and when these large scale owners decide to sort of wholesale put them all on the market.
Thank you. And how about you, Trom? What do you think?
Thanks, Yona. First, I want to thank you, Eleanor, and the research team for your incredible work, because it really affirms the lived experience of the BIPOC communities that we've been working with. And many times this type of research is often what it takes for policymakers to listen and believe our stories and fears. So thank you for that. Before I answer that question, I want to dissect what we mean by vulnerable communities, because majority BIPOC communities like North Minneapolis don't just happen to be vulnerable, right? The cards didn't just fall that way. These are places that have intentionally been targeted and made vulnerable through generations of discriminatory and extractive policies. So I want to ground us in that. For us at the Alliance, the growing presence of investor-owned SFRs is bad for renters and homeowners and the overall health of our region. Our partners at Inquilinos Unidos, I think there's going to be an article in the chat, they're doing some incredible work organizing North Minneapolis residents who are renting from a corporate owner, Havenbrook Homes, and it's a New York investment firm that owns more than 50,000 SFRs across the US. It was recently purchased by Pretium Partners, a private equity firm that is headed by a former bank executive who helped Goldman Sachs short mortgage bonds. And these transactions and flow of capital and wealth signal the further commodification and financialization of our housing system. But for me, what's most troubling is the fact that there are no guardrails in place, right? When something as damaging as corporate landlordship of SFRs is growing so vastly and coming up against so few barriers to success, it tells me that our housing system is designed to prioritize this type of wealth and extraction. And renters and homeowners run up against so many barriers to access and maintain stable housing, but the pathway has always been so easy and clear for investor owners to access our communities. So as housing advocates and policymakers, we're scrambling to put up some barriers to prevent their presence from growing and eventually eradicate it. This also tells me that this housing issue, as much as people like to say this, is not about supply and demand, right? It has always been about race and power. And that's why our work at the Alliance is focused on systemic change through policies that shift the power dynamics in our housing market. Because arguments like just build more are overly simplistic, and its proponents choose to ignore race and power dynamics, which is a privilege in and of itself. Because what happens when we build more? Who stands to benefit from it? Who can access that housing? Who builds the wealth from that housing? And the research being presented here shows that investment firms not only can, but do. So we can't just throw money into down payment assistance and be surprised when home buyers get outbid by private equity firms. We can't continue to pour water, a limited resource, into a leaky bucket without a longer term strategy for change. So we're advocating for policies that actually try to shift the power dynamics, such as tenant protections to limit the amount of power that landlords have to deny people access to housing, and policies like Just Cause, which limit the amount of power that landlords have to displace renters when they've done nothing wrong, which we know is happening a lot to push lower wealth tenants out of gentrifying neighborhoods.
Thank you, Trom. And I think some of those policy solutions we'll get to in a later question, but I also wanted to re-up what you pointed out about the fact that vulnerable communities are not, didn't come out of nowhere. They're not just, existing here today because of random forces. They're happening because of decades or even centuries of decisions made by policymakers and the private market to exclude people based on race and class. So we need to be cognizant of that fact and identify ways to help remediate that. So last panelist answering our first question, I'm just going to point it to Andrea, if possible.
Thank you. I want to reiterate the thanks to Urban Institute for this important research. I too am very concerned about the widening homeownership and wealth gaps. As noted, we already have the fourth largest homeownership disparities in the nation, and these shifts in the ecosystem that you really lifted have the potential to further exacerbate these disparities, as my colleagues noted. The fact is that Minnesota's racial and ethnic disparities in homeownership are built on a long history of exclusionary policies and practices that limit home ownership and its wealth building advantages to white households and devalue Black homes, a history of racist policies and practices that in many ways are alive and thriving today. What we see in this report are troubling indicators of further wealth extraction and exclusion as outside investors purchase these assets, potentially making acquisition by Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian families difficult. This is a new chapter of the same story in which white households can more easily acquire property, and these homes are more likely to increase in value and generate wealth and access to credit. So when I look at this data, I'm deeply concerned about the potential for continued gentrification of neighborhoods and the resulting displacement and economic inclusion of Black, Latinx, and Asian families. In terms of how this is informing our work at the Center for Economic Inclusion, we're really calling for cities and counties to invest in affordable housing options for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people, particularly strategies that facilitate home ownership, like down payment assistance, though as Tram noted, that alone is not enough in this changing marketplace. The center also calls for changes in lending practices to ensure access to affordable credit. So I'm just going to close in terms of this question by noting that the critical role that home ownership plays, along with business ownership and development, in enhancing intergenerational and advancing intergenerational economic wealth and prosperity, and one that we have to be focusing in on as a community. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. So let's move on to some questions that are posed to some of our specific panelists. So Tom, I have a question for you. So as state and local governments work to plan the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, maybe we'll even have a panel in person at some point, we do anticipate questions around how this might impact evictions. And you alluded to that in what you said a second ago. And we're specifically concerned about families that experienced housing instability even before the pandemic. Are local residents that you work with or that you're aware of in the Twin Cities concerned about a potential rise in evictions once the eviction moratorium stops being in place? And what types of support do you recommend as housing organizations work to address those needs?
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I think local residents are very concerned about a potential wave of evictions after the moratorium lifts. We've been doing a lot of work in making sure that there is an equitable off-ramp, that people are able to access resources to prevent evictions due to non-payment of rent. And we also know that the presence of investment firms in our housing market is really troubling, because we know that those types of owners evict at a higher rate, right? All the data presented by you and our partners at the Urban Institute is helpful in showing that web of connections and helping us see how closely related all of our inequities are. Because during the foreclosure crisis, who was targeted by predatory lending practices? After the foreclosure crisis, who suffered the most loss in home ownership and therefore wealth? And now, after investment firms have bought up many of those properties that BIPOC owners lost, who is likely to need to rent those single-family rentals? So if nothing else, we should see this sequence of events and stolen wealth and really question why our housing and finance systems allow or even encourage this type of predatory behavior. And back to your question, in regards to a COVID housing recovery, we're advocating for a variety of supports to help people get through the short-term crisis. But we also know that supports are temporary, right? And systemic change is lasting. So the eviction moratorium is great. We've spent a lot of time and energy maintaining a strong one at the state level, and we know that it has literally saved lives. Rental assistance is critical in keeping people in their homes, and we spent a lot of our time demanding that Rent Help MN is a more accessible program for renters to navigate and less of a bureaucratic nightmare. But what happens when the moratorium is lifted, right? What happens when rental assistance runs out? Are we willing to go back to a normal where we're okay with families getting evicted every day? For us, that answer is no. And so beyond those important supports, we're looking at long-term policies that disincentivize the presence of investor-owned SFRs. How can we do what our federal and state governments have failed to do and create the economic and policy conditions that are undesirable to investor owners, right? If we know what allows them to thrive, which is a lack of regulation, a lack of tenant protections, the ability to evict tenants without restraint, the ability to jack up rents, then we need to create policies that cut off those sources of profit. And we have to be really intentional about it. To us, that means stronger tenant protections, just cause eviction, and rent stabilization. And in the future, I hope it means intentional policies that are explicit in limiting who can buy homes in our city so that we can prioritize local homeownership.
Thank you. So Hennepin and Ramsey counties, as well as the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as the Metropolitan Council in the state of Minnesota, have all prioritized seeking racial equity in their long-term plans that they've developed over the last few years. And they've said that they support this as a major goal in some of their recent policy statements. So I'm interested in hearing from Colleen about the actual state of interest at different levels of government in the Twin Cities on addressing the homeownership gap and other issues related to racial equity. How have your organization worked to address racial disparities in homeownership and economic mobility in the region in the wake of George Floyd's murder? And what strategies are stakeholders in the Twin Cities already pursuing to promote additional homeownership for people of color?
So I'm actually going to pass to Andrea to go first on this, because she's actually been much more involved in the long-term planning with Center for Economic Inclusion. So if that's all right with you, Yona, Andrea, why don't you go first and then I can follow on your remarks.
Happy to. I'll just provide a few examples. So we've seen Ramsey County recently make a significant commitment to affordable housing for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people that includes a proposed HRA levy that could raise up to $11.5 million a year to fund affordable housing. We're seeing land trust models and some movement to reform zoning to allow mixed income communities and higher housing density in urban areas. And then we're also hearing about cities and counties targeting American recovery dollars to affordable housing opportunities, as you noted, Yona, inclusive of home ownership for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities. So those are just a few examples I'd share.
Right. Yeah, so on this note, I mean, both Andrea and Tram make really good points, and I would reference two aspects that relate to this question that I think are really essential. So one is related to reducing eviction that Tram talked a lot about as a way of stabilizing housing, which also then leads or is essential to economic mobility. And then the second is about combining homeownership and wealth building with a particular and very specific focus on BIPOC households. So on housing stability, we began working with local district courts in our region several years ago with the goal of reducing evictions by 50% in 5 years. And so we were starting with the chief judge in Ramsey County, which is where St. Paul is located, along with a large array of stakeholders, to create housing court clinics at every eviction hearing. Now, admittedly, and I think we all know, I mean, once you're at housing court, it is too far and too late, and it's not where we ideally want to start, but it is the sort of the backstop before someone loses their housing. And so I think it's really important to have something in place and a strategy in place there. And we know that eviction disproportionately by far impacts BIPOC households, and particularly Black single moms. So in this work, we worked to create this housing court clinic that would have lawyers, mediators, and the local county emergency assistance dollars right there at court to try to stem off an eviction judgment. But really importantly too, in addition to the resources, was work on the administrative policy at the courthouse. And I think we often talk about policy as large-scale legislative policy change, and that is really important. We have to do that. But equally important is the implementation of policy and the way that policy at an administrative level, at a local government level is implemented. So one very small example, but I think important and impactful, was in these settlement agreements that landlords and tenants are often negotiating at housing court. There are questions on the settlement form that have things like, how much are you agreeing, is any rent due? Are you agreeing to a move out, or you're staying in your home? Those sorts of questions. And one of the questions that was not on there was whether an expungement was a part of the agreement. And by simply adding that question onto the form, we doubled the number of expungements in a relatively short period of time. And so the combination of the court clinic, these additional services at court, and the changes to some of the administrative policies at court resulted in I shouldn't say resulted in, but happened at the same time as an 18% reduction in eviction judgments. I can't quite say definitively the causation effect, but there was a correlation, at least. Talking with Urban Institute researchers here, I need to make sure I'm careful with my words. And so that model has expanded. We've got 2 other counties in our region, Anoka and Dakota County, who have now adopted those same changes. And that, together with Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is situated, those account for, I think it's 92% of eviction filings in the state. So if we can get more supports and changes to the policies there, that goes a long way to our overall eviction rates. But again, I think really underscores the importance of sort of small p policy, administrative policy, local jurisdiction policy. The second I would mention is on relating to home ownership and wealth building. So in early 2020, we began working with a number of community partners to develop a program to support BIPOC owner occupancy of 2 to 4 unit rental properties. And that was really with 3 key goals in mind. So one is reducing the disparities in home ownership, 2, reducing disparities in wealth, and 3 is really an anti-displacement staying power, allowing households and families to stay in the neighborhoods where they have lived, they have made home, they have contributed to making them the dynamic neighborhoods that they are now. And so, maybe at the risk of stating the obvious, there are really 2 main points or ideas that really informed us and that, we know. First is that home ownership is the primary driver of most households' wealth in this country. We can debate whether it should be that, if that's an appropriate way to build wealth, if that is, if that's commodifying housing. But the reality is, it is where most households build their wealth, and so that's really important. And the second is, you need some wealth in order to purchase a home, and so wealth begets wealth, and a lack of wealth leads to ongoing lack of wealth. And so that, and particularly, as has been said before, BIPOC households have been, in Black and Indigenous in particular, historically, systematically locked out of wealth building over and over and over and over and over again for centuries, for the entire history and before the founding of our country. And so we are, we believe very strongly that, more down payment assistance is absolutely needed. But we really need to be targeted in it, and we should think of it in a reparations sort of focus of the households who have been locked out for so long. So I think that's there's has been since I think it's 1989 legislation at Congress for a reparations bill that may finally be going somewhere this year. It's never gotten a hearing before, but we can't wait for the federal government to act. And I think there's a call to action really for all stakeholders, whether it's the public sector and local government, private sector, individual donors, philanthropy, to really focus on reducing wealth disparities by prioritizing money for BIPOC households, and down payment assistance is one really significant way to do that. The second thing I would say is I think that banks really need to be a part. Andrea said this too earlier. Banks really need to be a part of this and fully acknowledge the role that they have played in the housing disparities, in redlining, in racial covenants, in everything, you name it, and going on to unfair credit systems currently. We work with a partner, Build Wealth Minnesota, who has looked at a lot of different people trying to buy homes, and there are lots of people who can't get traditional mortgages, but yet looking at their background and their financial situation, there are pretty easily explainable reasons that they feel they could underwrite for. And so I think really I would call on banks in particular to be a partner in this work, to really broaden who can access mortgage financing, and to prioritize Black and Indigenous households in particular, but all households of color, for down payment assistance programs and supports.
And I'm just going to actually, Colleen, just follow up very quickly for you. I'm noticing in the chat a question from my old friend Gretchen Nichols at LIST, Twin Cities, who's asking if there's a role for opportunity to purchase policies to disrupt investor owners and strengthen housing stabilization. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that question specifically.
I haven't thought a lot about it. I mean, I think it depends on the specifics. I know, Trom, you've thought a lot more about it. I think there's, here, let me get my thoughts. Trom, I don't know if Trom wants to, I know you've got positions, and I can say a bit more in a second.
Yeah, we've been working with a lot of nonprofit partners in Minneapolis trying to pass a tenant opportunity to purchase policy. And I think it's an incredible tool for intervention, right? Rather than allowing corporate investors and investment firms to swoop in and purchase housing that renters have been paying the mortgage for years, what a TOPA policy would do is give the tenants the first right to purchase, right? They can choose to either form a tenant union, a tenant cooperative, and purchase the building that they have been living and paying for and caring for, and have some kind of community or cooperative ownership. And another option with that is, if they don't feel like they want to purchase, because I think renting is a perfectly reasonable choice, they could also choose to partner with a community developer and work with a community developer, and a nonprofit one, to purchase and maintain that housing and add it to the affordable housing stock. So I think it's a really good, thank you, Gretchen, for looking that up, because it's a great intervention in trying to slow down the speed of the market, right? And we know that speed benefits money. And so when we're able to slow down these processes, let community members try to take ownership of the homes that they are paying for and living in, then it's a huge opportunity to intervene.
Thank you, Trom. So I'd now like to pass it on to Tony. There's been a lot of discussion in Washington, D.C. to try to develop some federal solutions to the problems that we're seeing in the Twin Cities and elsewhere. But place-based policies developed by local and state governments may ultimately be more effective. From your perspective as a researcher at Cura at the University of Minnesota, what are the various advantages of different policy approaches like rent stabilization, homeownership down payment assistance that we just discussed, and new affordable housing investments in terms of alleviating racial disparities in the region? Should one of these policies be prioritized over another?
Thanks, Yona, and thank you all to our wonderful panel here. Yeah, I mean, I think that's always the tough question, right? That with limited amount of time and resources, how do we really tackle these complex issues? And I really think we need to as much as possible, try to move away from saying there's one silver bullet, or we need to focus only on one type of policy or one mechanism. When we're talking about housing disparities and larger issues related to racial and economic justice, right? There's not going to be one policy or one set of areas that are going to do it all, right? They all have an important part to play. When it comes to rent stabilization, right? That's a local policy that can really hopefully smooth out a lot of the large rent increases that research that I've worked on has shown that have particularly impacted lower income renters who in the Twin Cities have seen, on average, they've seen their rents go up much more than higher income tenants over the past couple decades. So I think that's one important policy. Again, that won't solve all of the problems either, right? Because there's still a lack of affordable housing, period, out there. And so that requires new funding, new affordable housing strategies to protect currently existing affordable housing, while also, I think, investing in more permanent types of affordable housing, thinking outside of just LIHTC, thinking about land trusts, thinking about maintaining and preserving public housing, and also, talking about exclusionary barriers as well to more dense and potentially more mixed income housing. So I think it's really an all of the above solution. Again, also talking about homeownership as ways to build wealth in communities. So I appreciate everyone here and their comments, because I think we're all kind of on the same page that it's really should be an all of the above type of conversation, and that there are policies that we can do to support homeowners, but also to say that not everybody is in a place to own a home or wants to own a home. And so how do we, for lack of a better term, how do we walk and chew gum at the same time and really help all families, regardless of where they are, in their search for housing?
So I'd like to actually bring up some questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A from Jake Ackervik, sorry if I got your name wrong, and Sarah Burke, both of whom are bringing up the issue of community land trusts, CLTs. They're pointing out that community land trusts could play an important role in buying up properties in certain neighborhoods, perhaps preserving affordability in a way that existing resources are not, providing. Do any of you have any thoughts about the use of community land trusts? What are the pros and cons of that approach? I'll open it up to anybody.
I can say I think it's a really important tool to have in the toolkit. Community land trusts mean, for those who don't know, means that there is a so like, for example, in Minneapolis, City of Lakes Community Land Trust purchases a home and owns the land underneath, and then the home buyer purchases the building. And so the appreciation that tends to come in most in the real estate market, most appreciation is really about the land. It's about how valuable something is in a space, in a community over time. And so the land trust is holding on to the appreciation of the land, and the homeowner gets, if they choose to sell at some point, they would get some appreciation, but not the full appreciation that a typical seller would get. And so the downside, if you will, of it from an owner's perspective is you don't get the benefit of more appreciation. And so if you move, you don't get as much money out of that sale. But on the other hand, it is they do benefit, because oftentimes they wouldn't be able to purchase a home. They wouldn't be able to afford to purchase a home otherwise. And so it's absolutely a way to get into homeownership that allows homeownership for people who currently are often locked out of homeownership. And then from a community perspective, it ensures more diversity, socioeconomic diversity. So as properties appreciate in value over time, this is what we talked about in displacement, gentrification, whatever word we want to use, people can't afford to live there anymore. And so it creates opportunities for people along the economic spectrum to be able to afford to be in a neighborhood, in a community.
And, I think it's worth also asking whether solutions like community land trusts can be helpful to renters as well. I'm thinking about this specifically because we have an attendee named Martin Hernandez, who's pointing out that we need to do more to reduce the stigmatization of renters. Homeowners are held up as superior to renters in many narratives. So how do we change this narrative? And I'm wondering Are community land trust part of that? What are the other ways we can, make sure not only to support the growth of homeownership, but also support making sure that renters are considered equals in our society?
Yeah, I want to add a little bit to Colleen's answer about land trust because I think, well, shout out to Jeff Washburn at the City of Lakes Community Land Trust for doing an incredible job leading that organization. And one of the things that I love about the Land Trust Initiative is that it is a one-time investment that lasts in perpetuity, right? It doesn't, if I'm receiving down payment assistance on a home that that I'm going to sell later, if it appreciates, the next buyer is going to need more down payment assistance. With a land trust, it's a one-time investment that a city or a grantor can make, and it just continues to follow the land and the property to provide stability and affordable homeownership for generations to come. So I think that's one of the true benefits of a land trust that is not talked about enough. It's a one-time investment that lasts in perpetuity. And then I really appreciate Martine's question because I think he's right? We always talk about homeownership being this, the top of the mountain, right? And I think we need to acknowledge that and normalize the fact that renting for life is normal. It's the reality for many people. And we shouldn't, all of our solutions for renters shouldn't be about getting them into homeownership unless they want to. If they do that, that we should definitely. And we should also make sure that those who choose to rent have the protections and have enough power as renters to choose to stay as a renter in our city, in our country, without having to worry about the sustainability and stability that in the same ways that homeowners don't necessarily have to.
Thank you, Trom. So I'd like to actually move it to Andrea, who seems like she's about to be ready to speak anyway. So you can feel free to follow up on Trom, but I did want to ask you specifically whether there are communities in the Twin Cities that policymakers should really be focusing on, specific neighborhoods or suburban municipalities that really deserve more support and more focus. In our study, we found that North Minneapolis specifically was an area where we really want to focus our priorities, but maybe there are other parts of the Twin Cities that also need help. What do you think, Andrea?
Yeah, so before I answer that, I'm just going to touch on a little bit of out of the box thinking maybe on this last question, which is, I think we also have an opportunity to think about who owns these properties and the land, but also the buildings themselves, and how do we put that ownership in the hands of Black and Brown communities and as another means of building wealth. And so what does that sort of model look like, and how do we accelerate that as sort of another part of the ecosystem and ensuring that ecosystem is designed to build wealth in Black and Brown communities. But to answer your other question, Yona, I think, certainly ensuring safe, affordable housing and homeownership in North Minneapolis, Frogtown, Summit University, Rondo is critical. That's just to name, a few key neighborhoods here, and not to say that that's a comprehensive list. But I also think we have to consider housing access in relation to job opportunities. I think we have to ensure that affordable housing and home ownership, and for that matter, affordable rental opportunities exist within our growing suburban communities that are rich in those community assets like quality schools, jobs, parks, and libraries. So that's a few of the things that I think about in response to your question.
Fantastic. And Colleen or Trom, do you have any thoughts about other communities we should be focusing on?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. I think a lot of times we have this this false narrative that we need to move people to opportunity, and that erases the fact that opportunity is representative of public investment, and many times representative of whiteness, right? Because that's how the government has decided where and when to invest in a community. So yes, it is important to allow mobility if people want to choose to move to different neighborhoods. And it's also important that we don't redline, right? We want to invest in affordable housing in communities where people who need affordable housing live. Because to them, it's not I need affordable housing, it's I need stable housing that happens to be affordable. And we need to make sure that every neighborhood is a neighborhood of opportunity, because every neighborhood is one that has high quality schools, that has resources, that is not a food desert, that has libraries, right? We need to make sure that every neighborhood is full of opportunity rather than trying to move people to opportunity and kind of reinforcing the fact that it's okay to have neighborhoods that we don't invest in.
And I just want to follow up on the comment that Martine made in the chat and underscore what Tram said earlier about normalizing renting, and that renting is a good choice, and we need to support that too. And so that's, in my remarks at the very beginning, referenced my concern about these large portfolios, and if there's a sort of exit strategy and they're selling, there's often a narrative of single family home rental as being a bad thing. It's not inherently a bad thing. I think what's bad is when it is a large corporate investor who is from outside of the community and doesn't care a lot and is all about what the bottom line is. I think that local ownership is important. And so whether that's ownership by the person who's living in the building or the home or the house isn't so important, but I think that there is an investment, and I don't mean a financial investment, but an investment in the community, that the person who owns it, whether it's a business entity or an individual, that they are personally, emotionally invested in the community in some way. And I think that matters. I think it matters a lot. And when, and again, I think there is a need for single family rental opportunities. That is in particular what we don't have enough of larger units, 3 to 4 bedrooms, as I said, for families in our community. And so again, on the one hand, going back to homeownership, there's for some of that portfolio could be a good thing, but there's also some real downsides of it. And so I just thinking about this concept of portfolio ownership as nuanced, and that there are some things we need to be concerned about also if those go, quote unquote, back to homeownership, because again, it's not likely to be the same homeowners that they were who owned them previously.
I'm actually going to pick up on that by passing it over to Tony to try to answer a really hard question that I'm seeing in the chat from Matt Schroeder. So he seems to be asking, how do we see what's happened in the last 15 years within a historical context? He points out that in the Twin Cities, Black homeownership was about 45% in 1960, which is much higher than it is now. We've seen a significant decline from 45% in 1960 to about 30% in 2000 to about 20% actually in 2018. So what has happened? Why have these trends continued almost unabated over the past half century or more? And are there specific things we can be doing to be thinking more broadly, sort of at a historical level, that can help inform how we take actions into the future?
That's a really good question, and I think really hard to answer, completely, especially if we just want to talk about housing. I think what we've seen in the past, 50 years generally is a massive gulf of growing inequality across the board, right? When we look at incomes, when we look at wealth, the racial wealth gap is larger than it's been even before the 1960s. And so I think we want to look towards how our economy has changed over the last 50 years. We've seen massive deindustrialization, we've seen union density drop. We've seen a loss of public sector jobs. We've seen the minimum wage not keep up with inflation. These are all policies that have disproportionately in the past benefited low-income communities of color. And we've seen over time, as tax rates for the wealthy have dropped, that wealth is becoming more concentrated, and the people who are going to be hurt by these, whether you want to call it neoliberalism or whatever you want to call it, have been, I think, working class communities of color. And I think you see the most obvious example of this with the foreclosure crisis, right? When I can just say from personal experience, I was living in Milwaukee at the time, close to several working class Black neighborhoods, and we saw those neighborhoods be absolutely decimated through the foreclosure crisis, where one out of every, out of every 2 homes was vacant, right? And so we see these, again, through no fault of these communities on their own, but these much broader sort of global trends, I think really put, low income communities of color in the U.S. kind of at the whims of these much larger forces. And so I think, I think it's all of these, it's all of these sort of structural economic changes that I think are really, snowballing on top of each other to really stack the deck against Black and brown communities, particularly in terms of building wealth. Also, we should also talk about, mass incarceration and the police state, right? There's so many different systems and things that play into this. So, there's no simple answer, but I think it's all of these things combining together that really create these disparities. And so I think given all of that, as sad as it is, I don't think it's shocking that it's gotten larger.
And Tony, oh yeah, go ahead.
Just one quick, I would just also add, like the tech revolution and the advent of the smartphone, I think has completely revolutionized the housing investment landscape, that you can look at properties on your smartphone. There's management apps and things like that in a way to manage these large scale single family homes in a way that was never available and was before, and it was much harder for a national investor to have a portfolio like this. I think that has been a big contributor as well.
Yeah, exactly, Colleen. One of the things that we found in our study was that the rise of these institutional investors in part is being made possible by the fact that they can sort of run these single family homes through an app. It's a bit impersonal, but it's sort of easier for them to manage it at a wider scale. So that's how they've been able to adapt to the changes over time. But Tony, I did want to just bring up one last question related to research and things we need to know. So I'm seeing in the Q&A, Sharon Springer asks about the role of upzoning, which has been a big issue in Minneapolis, allowing people to build triplexes in a lot of single family home communities. I think she's wondering, how do we know what impact that will have on the community? And I'm also seeing Dakota Crowell asking whether investor ownership is accelerating the decline of affordable housing in these communities. Is it making rents more expensive? So what are the data points we need to be able to start answering those questions?
Right, and I think, what's so great about the research that Urban has done is they really gave a sense of like where what's the state of affairs, where are we at now? But as people in the chat have pointed out, it just begs more questions about what exactly is going on the ground. So one thing we would like to do, hopefully with Urban moving forward, is to tackle some of these questions, right? We have access to data. One thing we want to look at is really something that that's happened in other places is the pipeline from foreclosure through the foreclosure crisis from foreclosure to bulk sales to institutional investors and then to eviction, right? That other researchers have drawn a direct pipeline between these different types of exploitation that have taken place. And so whether it's, other research, as Trom pointed out, has shown that institutional investors tend to have higher eviction rates. I think another question that plays into that, are they charging higher rents? And so one question that we hope to tackle this is we have a data set on rental listings that we have a lot of data on single family rentals. And so we're hoping to combine that with data on evictions, data on past foreclosures and ownership structure to really get a sense of like, how are these markets changing? Are these institutional investors, are they charging more on rent? Are we seeing higher eviction trends? What's sort of happening? So I think there are a lot of open questions there. And additionally, kind of trying to unravel this web of LLCs, right? Because in many cases, it can be really hard for researchers like us or policymakers to know who even owns these homes in many cases, because it might be an LLC owned by another LLC that owns the home. And so it takes so much time and resources to figure out what the heck is actually going on, who owns this home, where are they? And so that's something that I think us at CURE are also really interested in trying to disentangle that web. And so I think there's a lot of open questions left out there, and hopefully we can take a bite out of that apple going forward.
Thank you so much, Tony. Okay, so in the last 1 minute we have left, if it's possible, I'd love to hear from Andrea, Trom, and Colleen. What is the top priority you want to see local policymakers focusing on to address some of the issues we discussed today in 10 seconds or less? So, Andrea, let's start with you.
I would say targeted investments and building wealth in our community, of which homeownership is a key mechanism.
Colleen.
Local ownership and control of land, and particularly rental and home owner occupant property.
And Trom.
I would say really trying to fix the power imbalance between owners and renters.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for being part of our panel today, and to the many attendees who were willing to join us today. We truly appreciate it. You can find out more about our work on some of the links we posted in the chat or at urban.org, which is our website. I also would just like to thank all 4 of the organizations represented on the panel today: Family Housing Fund, Cura at the University of Minnesota, the Alliance, Twin Cities, and Center for Economic Inclusion, as well as our funder, McKnight Foundation. It's been wonderful to work with you all, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with you in the months ahead. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.